Hello, everyone, and welcome to Colin and Adi's podcast. It's a podcast on the back of the book 50 Years of the Modern Oil Trading, which is linked to our recent book, Rivers of Money, Social and Economic History of the Modern Oil Trading. And today, our very distinguished guest is Neil Atkinson, a good friend, and a very, very senior person in the oil markets, distinguished person in the oil markets, who held many, many positions, among which probably the most prominent one was the head of oil and markets at the International Energy Agency. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you for having me.
As usual, as Colin and I like to do, we just want to hear you talk. And could you just introduce yourself a little bit and how you started in the oil markets?
Well, thanks very much. I often characterize myself as being almost literally the dumbest person at pretty well every company I've ever worked for. The reason being is that I left school at 18 years of age, having passed all my A levels, but not earned the grades necessary to take up the place at UCL in London to read law, which was my original ambition. I wanted to be a barrister specializing in criminal law. I didn't want to be a criminal barrister because that's a very different thing altogether. But so I left school basically because there was nothing else on available at university which really interested me, even though I had pretty decent grades. So I got a job in the British Civil Service as an executive officer in an outfit called the Crown Agents for Overseas Governments and Administrations, which was involved in distributing various aid packages to former Commonwealth, former Empire countries, Commonwealth countries. Anyway, I was an executive officer, which meant there were two levels below me. So that means I had a desk that had arms, I had a wooden desk, and I had my own rack to hang my coat on. So I was a big time. I was number 435 on the seniority list, which meant that an awful lot of people had to retire, die, go to jail, leave before I could rise up the greasy pole. So I'm sharing a flat in South London with two guys, both also called Neil, one of whom worked in the London office of Petróleos de Venezuela, which had been created in 1976 as a nationalized oil company of the Republic of Venezuela. They had a little London office which had 5 or 6 people working in it, doing market intelligence for the headquarters in Caracas. They wanted somebody, the job title was Statistical Research Officer. And even though I'm not an educated man, I can read and write and I can count. So I thought, blimey, this could be good. So I went to see Petróleos de Venezuela, and I was given a job by a great man who you, to my great joy, reference in Rivers of Money several times, the great Francisco Parra, Frank.
Wow.
And I was 21 years of age in 1979 when on March the 27th, I started working at PDVSA, and I worked there for the next 19 and a half years. And having worked for Frank Parra, I then worked for other distinguished Venezuelans, including the late, great Anurio Parra, who became one of my dearest friends and mentors. And in that 19 and a half years, I basically learned the industry. I knew nothing about oil. I only went to the job because my salary in the government went up from £2,750 a year to 3,500 overnight by joining PDVSA, and then to 4,000 a year after 6 months. Ka-ching. So over the next 19 and a half years, I basically learned the industry. I initially did tanker tracking because we were at PDVSA interested in finding out the levels of exports from fellow OPEC countries. There were no quotas in those days, but there was still obviously suspicions of cheating and various other nefarious practices. So over the years, I was trained up. I was sent on all sorts of courses. The late great Petroleum Economics Limited used to run a 2-week course in Geneva, which I enjoyed. College of Petroleum Studies at Oxford, which you also referred to in the book, did various courses there. So I became, apart from when barrel counting stopped being fun, I then became a junior analyst, supply and demand, price trends, geopolitics, and then senior analyst all the way through. by 1998, I'd been there 19 years. I just turned 40 that year. So in any year that ends with a zero, there's a little bit of, what's the future? What do I want to do next? And I did not want to go and live in Venezuela, which was offered to me as a possibility. My Venezuelan friends were saying back then that they die for their country, but they don't actually want to live in it. And I didn't really want to go there either. A quick footnote before we take a breath here is that alongside working at PDVSA during the 1980s in the London office, I was also an elected politician in London. I was a councillor, a Conservative councillor. And later on, my delusions of grandeur led me to join the parliamentary candidates list for the Conservatives. So another reason why, having decided to move on from Petroles to Venezuela to something else, decided I also wanted to pursue my political career, which petered out in, well, that's not relevant to this point. So that's how I got in. I got into the oil industry by chance. That was it, pure luck.
Neil, right away, obvious question. PDVSA and Venezuela so much in the headlines these days. I remember when I was a student, PDVSA was one of the most sophisticated oil companies out there. The executives were involved in I was at university at the Kennedy School with Professor Bill Hogan. He was working advising PDVSA on balances. He had a model that he worked with them on supply and demand and various other issues. So Colin, I don't know what you've done. I've got see you twice now. Um,
Not anymore, you don't.
okay, thank you. So, can you just tell us a few things about PDVSA in those days? Because I'm sure that a lot of young listeners wouldn't know.
Yeah, sure. You're right to say that it was a serious company. It was highly professional, very well managed. Now, when I first joined in 1979, nationalization had only been in effect for about 3 years or so. And the way the Venezuelans did it initially, they mirrored the pre-nationalization companies. So you had Creole, which I think was the Exxon subsidiary. Shell were in Venezuela, Gulf, Chevron, various others. And those IOC companies, pre-nationalization, were then mirrored by the establishment of various companies, Lagoven, Maraven, Corpoven, and the one or two others, which were essentially, ExxonMobil in exile or Shell in exile. And that went on for quite a few years, but there was a lot of duplication, a lot of waste. And eventually, the company under the management of Luis Giusti in the 1990s decided to essentially slim down the structure and transform PDVSA into basically an IOC, integrated oil company, production all the way through the midstream to the downstream to exports and all the rest of it. And it was a serious professional outfit. The reduction in headcount was done in a very professional way over years. There wasn't bloodletting. So by the mid 90s, or more accurately, the late 90s, when Chavez came to power, PDVSA was regarded as at that point, probably the leading national oil company. And that's not supposed to be, damning with faint praise. It really was very efficient. You went there to Caracas, to the PDVSA headquarters, La Campina, and you felt you were in a serious place. Dark wood, everybody wearing suits and all the rest of it. It was a serious company. And at that point, in the late 1990s, before Chavez came to power, PDVSA was producing about 3.5 million barrels a day. One of my jobs in the London office was every month was to lie to the press about what the level of production actually was, because the quota was a lot lower than the production. And I used to say, oh, it can't be what you say. I've got the official numbers here right in front of me. And they say, which is complete bullshit. So they were producing roughly 3.5 million barrels a day. There was a corporate plan, which I have a copy of somewhere in a box, and I wish I could find it, which envisaged by the second half of the 2000s, PDVSA's crude production capacity would get up to about 5.6 million barrels a day. Because the resources are there, there's no question of it. It was just a question of finding the money to make the investments. And the idea was to target the US market because the US is across the street from Venezuela, so to speak. Shale oil hadn't been invented, so to speak. So the idea was the US would continue to be a big importer, and who better to send them lots of oil than Venezuela, who by then had also, of course, invested in the refining industry in the US and elsewhere. So they had an outlet for their crude, heavier, sour crude, cheaper, so that gave a bigger return to the US refiners that took it. So, by the late 90s, by the time I decided to move on, PDVSA was in a good place and set fair for the next decades of steady growth under serious professional management, and then it all ended.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And now you move on to how did you get to the International Energy Agency?
Well, I got to there eventually via various stepping stones. I won't go through my life and times at every single one of these entities, but in 1998, when I decided that I should probably move on, my initial stepping stone was to go to Platts, which turned out to be not a good idea, although I met some good people there. My first encounter with Jorge Montepeque, for example, was at Platts. But cut a long story short, the consulting unit that I worked for was sold. I heard about it in the office kitchen by chance, was sold to another entity who combined it to form a company called DRI We One. That has now essentially moved, sort of morphed into what became IHS, and whatever IHS is now. I can't even remember these where all these murders have led us. So I did Platts for a while. It wasn't a big success, or the entity I moved into for Platts wasn't a big success. I was fired the only time in my life, alongside a bunch of other people. Then I spent a couple of years in Oxford working for Robert Mabro, who I knew professionally and personally, and that was pretty good. Robert retired, then instantly regretted it. I didn't get on with his successor very well, so I then moved to the Energy Intelligence Group, who published PIW and lots of other great publications, then into consulting, then into another business which we could come back to. But the main point then is the IEA. And I joined the IEA at the very start of 2016. I hadn't initially applied for the job because I was doing other things, and it wouldn't necessarily have been personally convenient to have come to Paris. But I was at an OPEC meeting in 2015, sitting around the lobby of one of the hotels with a bunch of my buddies, having a drink, chit-chatting, gossiping about what was going on or what wasn't going on, because until up to 2014, OPEC was pretty dull. Anyway, sitting in the lobby, and I happened to overhear a conversation at the next table saying, "Oh, the IEA, it looks like they haven't appointed a new head of the oil division." So my ears twitched and thought, "Ha!" So I got in touch with them because by then life had changed, and I thought this could be interesting. I got in touch, and I got a job. I managed to hurdle the dreaded OECD recruitment process, and although by the time I came into the frame, they had rejected the three shortlisted candidates that were presented to them. I think Fatih Birol himself personally rejected the three. I know who two of them are. I won't name names, and I think I know who the third one is, but they're all turned down. So they turned to me. So great. So I turned up, and then for the next 5 years, which is my contracted period, I was head of the oil division at the IEA, which is a great gig, and I enjoyed it enormously. But like all jobs, even the ones that you enjoy the most, it had its ups and downs. But on balance, I enjoyed it enormously, and I feel very grateful to have had the opportunity.
We didn't talk much about the IEA in our book, Neil.
You barely mention it.
We barely mentioned it. Well, you see, it was about traders and people and
Oh, sure.
places rather than oil markets. But at your time in the organization, how did you view traders? Helpfully, as helpful or unhelpful, or how did you view them?
Well, to be honest with you, not very much at all, because partly because of my background, I have never been a trader. I think I would have been a dreadful trader. I don't think I could have coped with being an analyst in a trading environment because it's high pressure and all the rest of it. I had some friends who worked with Peter Ginu at Smith Barney back in the day. I see a wince there, and I couldn't have done that. So I was basically a sort of slow, steady supply demand fundamentals kind of guy, looking at the numbers coming in every week, every month, or then with greater frequency as the technology improved. So, to all intents and purposes, we really didn't have much involvement with the trading community. This is historically before the IEA, until, of course, 2008. And 2008 changed everything because that became the great debate. There was the zoom up to $146 a barrel and the plummet to $36 a barrel. Speculators hiss boo, and of course that has never been resolved, or fully resolved. So, to all intents and purposes, trading was something that went on over there. Nobody really understood it. We knew it had an impact on pricing, of course, but we believed that underlying fundamentals, how much supply was growing or falling, demand growing or falling, that was the underlying driver of the market, which of course is true. But I'm trying to avoid saying excesses, but the movements up or down, were, shall we say, exaggerated. I'm trying to think of better language here by the kind of guys that, well, you were. So the contact and the interaction really with traders and the people that you talk about in your book was pretty minimal at the IEA. Earlier on, by the way, at PDVSA, we're now very close to IP Week, as we old timers still like to call it. And PDVSA held a reception every year during IP Week at the Grosvenor House Hotel, as did, every man, woman, and their dog. And we invited hundreds of people in the hope that they all wouldn't turn up, but a large number did. And during that whole week, all the traders from PDVSA, still back then, Lagerven, Maraven, Corpoven, would come to London. We'd have huge numbers of meetings in our office. I would sit in on many of them, having to take notes, because that was one of my great skills, reading, writing, and counting. I could take notes. And we used to have all these meetings with the traders. And a lot of the companies that you refer to in your book from those early days in the 80s and the 90s, they came to us, or we would go to them. And some of the great names that you mentioned, yes, we had interaction with them then. But then, of course, it was far simpler. Of course, I mean, the role of the trader was far simpler than it has become. And obviously, with financialization, it's now so complicated. But at the IEA, essentially, the work that we did was very, very simple. Very, very simple. What are the supply numbers? What are the demand numbers? What are the stock numbers? How many missing barrels have we got? What do we think is going on in the market? Which I wrote the editorial every month. And that was it. That was it. If we had met you on a regular basis, we probably would have understood what the hell you were talking about.
Well, we of course were in great awe of you.
And I'm not sure you were either, actually.
We were in great awe of you as major producers and end users at one stage, of course, with Citgo as well. So I think the way we viewed each other was slightly different, but each in awe of each other somewhat. Eh?
But Neil, it's interesting. I know, obviously, from our sort of personal conversations, that you just mentioned how IEA was at the time. And I would just like to see, I know you've got some views on, strong views about IEA today and IEA then. And I would like to hear from you. Is there an IEA that you would like to see somewhat different?
Well, when I joined the IEA, we were putting out every month the oil market report, which the subscriber list basically was everybody. Everybody you could think of who had interest in oil markets subscribed to it. One of my proudest moments was jacking up the subscription price by 20% in 1 year, having found it hadn't gone up for the previous 10 years. But anyway, that's by the by. when I joined the IEA, we were doing our monthly oil market reporting and commentary. Once a year, we would put out a 5-year outlook for the oil market. And the message for the first few years when I was there was the same every year. Oil demand is going to continue to grow by at least 1 million barrels a day every year, as far ahead as we were willing, and a little bit more than 1 million barrels a day. But we thought that the pace of growth might start to slacken towards the end of the forecast. So then the question arises, where does the supply come from? Was there any spare capacity constraints, say, within the OPEC countries? Was there enough investment going on in the non-OPEC group of countries on the other side of the balance? And we were warning every year, because I still got these documents, of the dangers of the lack of investment, because demand is going to keep on going up. So in a way, it was very conventional, and personally, it was what I personally believed in and agreed with, and there was never any pushback at all from above me, i.e. Fatih Birol. None whatsoever. And indeed, I'm happy to say that in all my time there, which ended 5 years ago, I was never given instructions to say something or write something along a certain line. Never. I would write the editorial every month, the commentary. It would go to colleagues for peer review, which is a good thing. Because I'm perfectly capable of writing something stupid. So they would take a look at it, comments would come back, very good, interesting, and then go to Fatih as the final judge. And I rarely got an adverse comment. He might say something, for example, after OPEC had met and they'd taken some decision or other. I used to put in some line about OPEC has provided a great service to the oil markets by taking a clear decision which gives us clarity for the next, blah, blah, blah. And Fatih would say, so very good, you're sending flowers to OPEC. So I used to, like little phrases like that, but I was never influenced or told what to write. Now, towards the end of my time, there was a pivot within the IEA over which I had very little influence because I was doing all short-term stuff, and the big picture work the IEA does, the World Energy Outlook, carried out in a completely different part of the agency, what I used to call Planet WEO, World Energy Outlook. They were beginning to pivot, and of course that found its peak, if you like, in 2021 with the launch of their net zero by 2050 scenario, which is a scenario, not a forecast. One should be fair to them. Now, we should also be fair to the IEA in saying that, of course, the Paris Climate Agreement was signed at the end of 2015, and all the member country governments of the IEA were signed up to it, every single one of them. The US was, then it wasn't, then it was, now it isn't again, but everybody was signed up to it. And the governments that came and went in the various 31, whatever it is, member countries of the IEA, nearly all developed policies which you would describe as being encouraging the energy transition to greater and lesser extents. So the IEA, in making a pivot, was to some extent answering or responding to the direction of travel of its member governments, who was saying, we want more work done on renewables or energy transition issues generally. So the IEA was responding to that. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a member-led organization. It works at the direction of its member countries. Every 2 years, there's a big ministerial do here in Paris where they set the agenda for the next couple of years. 3 or 4 times a year, the IEA's governing board meets to mark its homework. So it's a member-led organization. However, the mistake the IEA made, and I've been very critical of this, and my colleagues in Washington, is that fine, have all of these scenarios looking as to what might happen if all the government policies, all the government environmental wish list were implemented, the market would look like this. Come up with a scenario that in net zero by 2050, what might that look like? That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. However, probable you think those outcomes might be. It's a matter of opinion. What the IEA should not have done was ditch what is called the current policies scenario, which is anchored in what is actually happening today, as opposed to your aspiration for today. It's your baseline forecast, and it tells you what is likely to happen if current policies are implemented, but not enhanced or expanded. And so the IEA is eventually bowed to pressure mainly from the Americans, and I played a modest role in this, but it's now bowed to this pressure and reinstated a current policy scenario, which is as close as you get for what is essentially likely to happen if we carry on the current implemented policies path. They continue to be implemented, but they're not strengthened. And as a result of reinstating that scenario, the IEA is now telling us that under that scenario, oil demand, which is what I know best, oil demand is going to continue to grow all the way out to 2050. So, if you like, it's a reality check. But the IEA has now reinstated it, which is a good thing. But it came under a lot of pressure to do it. And my contention is that it should never remove that scenario in the first place. You need to anchor your outlooks in something, what we call it the return of energy realism. By all means, have these scenarios looking out to the future. Great, there's nothing wrong with that, and it's extremely useful. But the IEA's outlooks are very influential. While I don't necessarily agree with the statement, some of my Washington colleagues are a bit keener on this than me, that the oil companies get the World Energy Outlook every year. They think, oh my God, that's it. There's no more oil needed after whenever. We should stop investing. I don't think it's obviously as simplistic as that. But if you believe that oil demand is going to continue to grow for the foreseeable future, we can argue about the longer term, then we need supply, and supply has to come from investments. And historically, investment, well, certainly since 2015, investment in upstream oil and gas, because the numbers are also mushed in together, has not been high. And there is a potential issue in a few years' time, if demand does continue to grow, that we might be in a supply crunch. But we predicted, supply peak supply in the past and been totally, utterly wrong about that. And again, in your book, one of my great heroes and a personal friend through football, Professor Peter Odell, is mentioned in your book twice, I think. And Peter was knocking into my head very early on about the stupidity of peak oil supply. And I think Maury Edelman may have been along in that camp as well. Sorry, name dropping here, but we all hate name droppers, as I said to the king just the other day.
But you talk about all these names. That's interesting, you see, because you've been involved in the business since 1976, and you must have known the Mark Riches, or been aware of the Mark Riches of this world, and the John Lichtblaus and Walter Levy's, and different different people in different parts of the business. If you think back over the whole period of your career, who are the folks in your mind that you really felt were influential in the way that oil markets developed?
Well, were they influential in the oil markets developed? In the trading world, the people who were my heroes and mentors, who I literally worked with and got to know, were very much in the old established pre-trading world. So, for example, in the 80s and 90s, when, as you outline in the book very eloquently, oil demand in the early 80s collapsed after the Iranian Revolution. Prices shot up, and the collapse in demand coincided with the rise of the North Sea and Alaska, Gulf of Mexico, Mexico, one or two other places. So the OPEC countries found themselves in this mess. That led to what we called the producer-consumer dialogue. And in the mid-80s, as still a youngish man, I was on many occasions helping to draft remarks to be given by the late great Alirio Parra, who was the head of the London office of PDVSA. Later, Alirio was Venezuelan oil minister and president of OPEC, and basically taking the line from another late great figure from the past, Professor Paul Frankel, that oil is too important to be left to the markets. It's too important. And what we had to try to find a way of achieving was a balance between a price which was enough to satisfy the needs of the producers and indeed encourage investment, but a price that was not so high that it deterred demand. And this producer-consumer dialogue movement, if you like, went on through the late 80s into the 90s. Illyrio Para was very influential in that, as was Robert Mabro. So they were the great, amongst others, the great influences on me. I believe oil is too important to be left to the market argument from Paul Frankel, whose book, The Essentials of Petroleum, was one of the first things I ever read in 1979 when I joined PDVSA. So the trading part of it, certainly in those years, because don't forget, I can remember a guy, I think his name was Bob Wilson, who I pretty think was, well, maybe Daniel Carr as well, or instead of, I can't remember which now. When NYMEX was established in 82, 3, whenever it was, we had a visit from, it may even before NYMEX was officially born, we had a visit and they came into our conference room in London, and some of the PDVSA traders were also there. It's probably during IP week. And we were, you guys, you're a huge producer, you're a sophisticated, integrated companies selling all sorts of crude and products into markets around the world. We need to work with you, hedging, all this kind of stuff. But that didn't really, in Venezuela, that never really took off in the way that it did, say, in Mexico, which is legendary. Every year we used to get these great articles in the FT or whatever about the fabled Mexican hedge. But Venezuela never really got into that, because there was a lot of political resistance to what the Mexicans were doing. And I don't think they understood it actually as well. I just don't think they had anybody of their own that really knew what was going on. And I remember some young guy being sent from Caracas for about 3 months or something, given an office. And he had a Reuters screen, one of those green screens that we used to have when we were little. When you weren't looking at page SPOA, which is the sports page, you'd then be looking at the prices. And this guy was attempting to run a model, a simulation of here's 2 million barrels a day of Venezuelan exports. Let's hedge all this lot, well, not all of it, obviously, and see what we achieve. And I don't think they really knew what they were doing. So, my mentors and heroes were not people like Mark Rich or any of those individuals or entities, because for most of my PDVSA career, we just weren't working with them. Some of the guys in Caracas, in Lagavulin, Marin, and Cordovan, yes, they were, and it got it got closer as the years went by. In my personal experience, no.
Yeah, I'm not sure we would count them as our heroes necessarily, Addy, but
No,
certainly they
I
were.
was
Yeah, no, I
being,
know, but they were significant, I think, influencers in the way in which the structure of oil markets from a trading perspective developed. But it's interesting you mentioned Daniel Carr, who I think was an ED&F man at the time, and they were one of these companies who were involved in NYMEX and in the emergent IPE in the mid-80s, who were going out and talking to the producers and trying to persuade them to become involved in hedging. And you were right to say that there was a lot of resistance at the time, and very few really did get involved relative to the number who perhaps could and should have been involved. The same, I think, is still true today. 50 years-ish on, you still have the ED&F mans of this world running around trying to persuade the producing countries to get involved in markets, and to some extent, to a greater extent probably, without success, which is a strange thing, really.
well, Abu Dhabi is becoming, or has become, much more modern, if you like, in that respect. Actually, theories about ADNOC, but it's another story. The PDVSA issue, there was a lot of political resistance because it was seen as gambling. Now, obviously, to some extent, a hedge, it can go horribly wrong. You've hedged your production at, I don't know, $60 a barrel, and the price shoots up to 120. Dear oh dear, well, look, we've left all this money on the table. Conversely, of course, you've hedged at 60, whatever it is, it goes down to 30, and good thing. But it was considered to be gambling, and it was politically sensitive at a time when PDVSA in the mid 90s, because it had got rid of the Lagervens, Maravens, and Corpovens of this world and become PDVSA as essentially an integrated oil company, an international oil company. It was basically PDVSA was becoming seen by political opponents in Venezuela as a state within a state, which it almost was, actually, in fairness, because it was a rare example in the country of something that was incredibly well run and professional. And indeed, there were rumors at that time, and I remember this very well. And indeed, Muhanna, the Saudi oil whisperer, has written about this in his book, Oil Leaders. I remember strong rumors in the mid 90s that if the leadership of PDVSA had its way, they would leave OPEC. They would leave. It was a live discussion within the upper echelons of PDVSA, but of course that became moot when Chavez came to power.
Well, that's really interesting, Neil. That's great. I just want to come back a little bit to this point of that you mentioned um, oil market. Actually, sorry, oil being too important to be left to the market. I think that was quite prevalent up to the stage. I was at university at the time when financialization happened, and Colin and I wrote a lot about that. And I think once the financialization happened and everybody else got involved in the market and started using oil as a hedge against inflation and whatnot, I think that then really sort of the horse bolted out of the barn, and I think there was no going back. I just, you know.
No, at the time I read Frankel's book, and later on when I went to the Petroleum Economics Limited seminar in Geneva when Frankel was still with us, although very old by then. When I read the book, this is the late 70s, don't forget, and the political climate was very different. I mean, this was even just before Mrs. Thatcher came to power, and the phrase "commanding heights of the economy" was still part of the political economy sort of phrase commonly used. Governments either controlled or had a significant interest in the commanding heights of the economy. And in the UK, that included, of course, BP. So the idea that that oil was too important left to the market was, if you like, sort of wedded in the post-war settlements and the rebuilding of Europe after the war, where governments did have significant stakes. So that mentality, it was too important to be left to the market, was very important. And of course, it was part of the reasoning or the rationale behind the creation of OPEC, because of course the countries had been, many of the leading producers by the early 60s realized that they'd actually been screwed by, in some cases, by the majors, the Seven Sisters. So it was a phrase of its time. So yeah, is it too important to be left to the market? Well, it still is, because we still have OPEC acting as a form of regulator of production, although OPEC's influence waxes and wanes over time, and people say, "Oh, OPEC's finished." That's baloney. But its influence rises and falls over time, and OPEC regards oil as too important to the global economy or their economies just to be left to find its own way. And we saw the consequences of the reverse, of effect, a free market. I remember in January 2016, the first editorial I wrote for the IEA in the oil market report, at the end of my second week, I think it was that because of the OPEC decision at the end of 2014 to essentially abandon the quotas, because shale was becoming a big thing, it was reaching its first peak. Let's see what happens. So we had the price collapse almost on the day OPEC made that announcement, November 27th, 2014. The price went down about $10 in one day, from 80 to 70 or something, having been 120 earlier in the year. And by January 16, when I joined the IEA, Brent, I think, sort of went a bit below $30 a barrel for a little while. So that was what a free market, to all intents and purposes, which is what it was. That's what a free market gave you. And that is not good for anybody. It's not good for the producers, certainly not in terms of their income, but it's not good for future investment. And it's great for consumers, of course, who doesn't like low prices. But it was ultimately a bad thing, and action had to be taken.
Yep.
OPEC reasserted control of a kind, and then expanded its coverage to bring in the Declaration of Cooperation countries, mainly Russia and a few other odds and sods as well.
Well, that's quite timely because yesterday we saw a big bubble in the gold and silver prices collapse as well.
Well, as it collapsed, I looked this morning because I track several things, as you might imagine, and I thought to myself, what's gold now? $50 or something. I mean, it's not a collapse, is it? I mean, there's got to be a lot of profit taking
It
going
did
on.
go down to 4,400 or something, I think,
Oh, did
yesterday.
it really?
Well, I think as long as the US wants a lower exchange rate, then gold
Yeah,
has
This
the
gold thing,
prospect of rising, doesn't it, and continuing to
yeah.
rise.
this gold thing is bonkers. I was doing some numbers at the weekend for something I'm doing in due course, and I went back through my database, and gold got to $1,000 in September 2009. It then took 2,800 days to get from 1,000 to 2,000. It then took 1,200 days to get to 3,000, 145 days to get to 4,000, and 78 days to get to 5,000. And this is insane. This is
Yeah.
insane. But
That's
anyway,
markets for you. Well,
that's
anyway,
markets.
Neil, well, this is a wonderful conversation which will continue, I'm sure, soon. And having time in mind, can you just tell us a little bit about your sort of latest involvement? And you mentioned Washington, and it'd be good to know what you're working on.
Well, since I left the IEA, I've described myself as an independent energy analyst, IEA. Get it? And although I do regret that having bought a domain name, energyanalysis.fr, I haven't described myself as CEO, which seems to be something that a lot of other people get away with, but I haven't done that. And over the past nearly 5 years now, I'm called on to give presentations on the short-term oil market outlook, mainly for from time to time, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Societe Generale, and a few others. I write from time to time, as you do, in the Petroleum Economist. I've done specific projects for White and Case. They have a big energy practice on a study of an institution in the Middle East, which I won't name, that we did work on. And since 2024, I've been involved with the National Center for Energy Analytics, which is a Washington-based think tank, although it's not really Washington-based as such, because it's mainly virtual. But and they wanted me to come in and do some work commenting on IEA output because they take a very strong view. Well, they have views about the energy transition, which I don't necessarily share, but I am someone that believes that the energy transition is, despite what Addy likes to say from time to time in social media, I still think is proceeding at a stately pace rather than a revolutionary one. But they wanted me to comment, and because I strongly disagreed with the IEA's decision to dump the current policies scenario, I was very happy to jump on board. So I wrote a paper in January 25, which was very critical and used very strong language. But a year later, we've done an update, a shorter update, which is rather more, if you like, congratulatory because the IEA has brought back the current policies. So I'm doing quite a bit of work for them and other bits and pieces. But I'm in a stage of life now where I don't necessarily want to go back into corporate life unless I get to be the big boss and then can tell everybody else what to do. I'm done with being a corporate wage slave. So I've been doing various bits of this, bits of that, and I continue to live in Paris because by choice, because it's very agreeable. And yeah, in fact, you guys have got me, now extremely nostalgic. I'm almost in tears as I was thinking back to some of those days in PDVSA and in one or two of the other places, which, well, tears of joy and sentimentality for PDVSA, tears of rage and anger for one or two of the other places. But it's an interesting exercise to look back. But
I'm glad our book could do that.
Yeah, well,
Well, no, the
history
book,
history can make you very maudlin, though, can't it? Really.
well, yeah, but you think of some of these people, and like I say, I read it in two halves because I actually started reading it during the Christmas holiday, then put it to one side. But there were sort of names that came out. I thought, bloody hell, I hadn't heard of her for a very long time. You know, Doris Balser, for example, was a name that leapt out at me because a young fellow who worked for me at PDVSA left to join Rhine Oil as a sort of, I don't know exactly what he was doing, but doing something anyway, because he got a big bump in pay, and of course they paid bonuses and that sort of thing, which PDVSA didn't. Fair enough. I think he didn't last more than a few weeks, and at the hands of her, and he came back with his tail between his legs, which is, a shame. He was a nice guy, but he just wasn't cut out for it. But I saw names like that and various others which I've come across over the years, and yeah, it's sort of nostalgic. But as I said to you, I'm not really the perhaps the best guest for a podcast of guys of your background because my involvement in day-to-day trading has been non-existent. I've been the guy that has, we're all old enough to remember before the internet, or indeed before we ever knew the word. And in my professional career, starting at PDVSA in the 80s, pretty well through the 90s, they needed something like an office in London to tell them what was going on. So my first task every day, getting in about 8 o'clock in the morning, was to start writing up based on Platts Oil Ground News and other things that we'd heard or seen in the market that were of interest to them, whether it's fundamentals, new numbers on supply and demand of stocks, or just gossip, we've heard blah, blah, blah. And we used to send that so that when the Caracas guys got into their office, they were 4 hours or 5 hours behind, depending on the time of year, they would have something from the London office giving them a steer of what was going on. And of course, we had to have it typed up by the telex operator in those days. That's how it worked. Now, of course, fast forward and things are completely different. But, so my involvement has always been on what's going on fundamentally. And in those, certainly in the 80s, trading in the way, and to the extent that it has morphed into what you described today, particularly at the end of the book in the financialization section, where you really are in a situation now where I've always cynically believed most of the senior management of these companies didn't know what the hell everybody beneath them was doing, but didn't care as long as it made lots of money.
Very true.
I'd long since moved on.
So has Donald not tapped you up for your Venezuelan experience yet, Neil? And looking forward to you coming down and helping him, no?
Well, I was supposed to be in Washington last week
Ah, ah,
to do the launch at the paper I've just published with Adam Saminsky. We were supposed to launch it at the U.S. Senate. We do that every year where a couple of U.S. senators grace us with their presence. We get somebody from the industry. We do it as a sort of morning thing. And I do my thing as well. And in the course of the week, I was due to also have one or two meetings, either individually in a couple of cases, but with others at places like the API, in the US Energy Department, and one or two places like that. However, I did, because I couldn't travel to DC because the weather was so dreadful. It wasn't going to be feasible to move around on the ground. You could fly there, but that was it. And if you try and get around in an Uber, surge pricing comes into play here, and surge is the word. So I did everything from here, and I had a call with someone in the U.S. Department of Energy, who was basically seconded to the Venezuela beat, and I think he may well be going down there soon to actually sit in the newly reopened embassy and start getting actively involved in the rejuvenation of the Venezuelan oil industry and the commercial side of it. Who can they sell to? How much? By what means? And all the rest of it. Where's the money? So I was asked about my impressions of PDVSA and my views on its potential, which was nothing particularly sophisticated. I basically no, we dreamed of 5.5 million barrels a day when I was a lad. Just let them get on with it, and we could do that again. All the rest of it. But I was asked for my views, and while you can have reservations about the means by which the United States is influencing events in Venezuela, the two people I know who still live there, pretty well everybody else over the years left years ago because it's become a shithole country. The two people left straight after the removal of Maduro. We were able to have a WhatsApp exchange. They were thrilled, absolutely thrilled. What they're not happy about at the moment, although this may change, is that there's no path been laid out as to how there could be a transition to a genuinely elected government.
No strategy,
There's no
just a
strategy
vacuum.
yet. But the problem with that is although the opposition did win 18 months ago, massively absolutely doubts that. You can't just say, well, 18 months ago, this guy won, let's stick him in. That's not going to work. You need to have fresh elections, fresh start. And that is what I hope will happen. But I also believe that the Venezuela to recover economically, it's only going to be done by the oil industry. And the only way the oil industry can get back on its feet quickly, there's no reliable power supply in huge chunks of the country. There's no reliable food and fuel distribution in parts of the country. There's no security in parts of the country. If you can get that sorted out and then bring in the money, which, ExxonMobil, Shell, whoever else, and say to these guys, right, there it is, fix it up, here's the deal. You could get Venezuela's production up and running, I think significantly quicker than most of the estimates that have been put out there. Like 10 years. But maybe, right? But I think it could be, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there.
There's your new CEO job that you were talking about.
Sorry?
There's your new CEO job you were talking about. Go for it.
Well, maybe, guys,
Go for it.
You should think about reopening your office in London. I'd love to go back. See,
A new one in Paris, perhaps.
Well, new one in Paris. But seriously, the London office at its peak was incredibly important because, as I say, the communication with Caracas wasn't instant as it is now. The meetings we used to have with BP and Shell, the representative offices of Mobil and Conoco, all those guys in London, the banks, we were having these meetings the whole time. And London was where you needed to be.
Well, I'm so glad you said that because pretty much that's what the book is about. It's about people and places.
Yeah,
And the market is a social construct.
If I had £1 for every pint I drunk in the grapes back then, I could retire.
Well,
and some of the restaurants, Mr. Kai, and
yes.
which you don't mention in the book, but Mr. Kai and
some of those
great places in Mayfair, because we were in Old Park Lane, which is the little road that runs up the side of the Hard Rock Cafe. So we were adjacent to Shepherd Market and that whole Mayfair environment. And so I know that area extremely well.
Well, Neil, we're out of time. I thank you very much for this most fascinating chat. We are also very, very lucky to be able to see you next week and continue this conversation over a pint of warm beer.
I'm sure we can get a pint of warm beer somewhere. Although I'm scaling back, I'm not going to everything anymore because I can't be, frankly, I'm tired of it. And so I'm doing one or two other things, and I'll be in England for the weekend and through most of next week. Well, in fact, the whole of next week. So I hope to catch up at some point.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Neil.
Good job. Great.
My pleasure, gentlemen, and
very
congratulations
Thank you.
on the book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, see you soon.